Brise de Mer had carefully thought its plan out. For this unprecedented heist, the Bastia clan Brise de Mer opted for a home game. And it chose to act on a very specific day. During Easter weekend, a sacred day for Corsica. During that period, cities emptied out as their inhabitants went back to their hometowns to celebrate the religious holiday. A perfect opportunity for Brise to take action in a deserted Bastia. The target was one of the largest banks in the city, Le Crédit Lyonnais. Brise decided to bet on a new, very promising recruit to plan the heist, Rishad Casanova. He was able to get the area's floor plans by bribing an employee at the bank. When meticulously studying these valuable documents, he found a flaw in the security system. On the second underground level of the building next door, only one wall separated the stairwell from the vault. The wall was made of cinder blocks and had no alarm system. In less than 30 minutes, the armed robbers had accessed the lockboxes.
Yeah, these were small lockboxes, so you could, open them like cans of sardines with a hammer and a chisel. There were, 250 of them. The issue was knowing when to stop.
Les malfaiteurs sont passés par le portail d'un immeuble attenant à la banque. Dès 14 heures, des voisins ont entendu des bruits et c'est finalement vers 19 heures que les malfaiteurs ont été interrompus par les concierges de l'immeuble.
Qu'est-ce qui s'est passé?
Eh ben, ils nous ont braqués et puis c'est tout. Hein.
Ils ont frappé votre épouse, n'est-ce pas?
On m'a donné deux fois deux coups de crosse sur la tête. Et j'ai été allongée par terre. Après, j'ai rien vu. Vous voyez?
C'était dans le noir, là.
They had to leave 2 full bags behind, but they'd already taken a lot.
The robbers opened 159 lockboxes and took several million francs, though the bank refused to reveal the exact amount. This was the first robbery of this magnitude for Brise de Mer. The master stroke got Rishad Casanova, who'd just turned 23, his official induction into the Bastia clan. He joined the head of the crime group, alongside the man who would become Brise's second legendary bank robber, Francis Mariani. It was a seminal robbery, like the starting point of a long series.
La Brise de Mer and armed robberies. It was their priority, their specialty.
They were pros at bank robberies that were mounted like clockwork.
They meticulously planned their heist. Everything was thought of in advance. It was La Brise de Mer's trademark.
It's the fastest way for a thug or a gangster to get rich. Richard Casanova and Francis Mariani progressively gained power inside the organization, committing several robberies in a row. The two men seemed to be polar opposites. Francis Mariani was violent and high-strung. Richard Casanova, on the other hand, was the handsome thug.
Richard Casanova was a guy who was educated, smart. He kind of looked like a rich kid. He was clean-cut. You would never have thought that he was capable of murder or robbery by looking at him.
He was definitely someone who had a higher-than-average intellect.
He was the brains of Brise. He was a genius.
Francis Mariani was more of an unpolished character. We're talking pure violence.
Francis was a guy who wasn't afraid of anything. It felt like you were dealing with an animal, a wild beast.
The two progressively gained a form of notoriety and influence inside La Brise de Mer.
For me, they were serious bank robbers. They were exceptional guys. I don't think there'll ever be anyone like them.
Rishad Casanova, Francis Mariani. Two names that left their mark on the history of La Brise de Mer. And yet, nothing predestined them to meet. Francis Mariani was from a mountain village an hour away from Bastia. He grew up in a modest family of farmers, left school at 14, and became a father at only 16. Rishad Casanova was 10 years younger and grew up in the center of Bastia, pampered by his parents, who were well-to-do shop owners. He was comfortable. He was a star student at school. He skipped grades, and the teachers loved him. Francis Mariani quit school at 14, and his journey as a gangster started quite early. He was imprisoned for armed robbery when he was 17. At that time, the two future godfathers of La Brise de Mer didn't know each other. They each entered organized crime their own way. But it didn't happen in Corsica. It happened on the mainland.
In the late 70s, they began their careers as henchmen for the Marseille crime world. It was the school of crime. Marseille was the historical headquarters of Corsican organized crime. For young Corsicans who wanted to learn the ropes, Marseille was the place to go, where it all happened.
When he arrived in the city of Marseille, Francis Mariani didn't know a soul, but he did, however, know where he was going.
My parents had a bar, the Vieux Canal bar, in the center of town, behind the old harbor. It was different from today. Today, it's touristy, but at the time it was actually pretty sordid. There were legionaries, thugs, a few prostitutes. There were, and the Corsicans showed up. When a Corsican got to Marseille, he would always go and see another Corsican, and they would show up at our place. Francis didn't have a penny to his name. He was broke, he was unhappy. He had come to carry out robberies. In the bar, he met other young guys like him. They were all from Marseille. 4 of them went to Paris, and they robbed some banks.
The first bank robberies were not major heists. In that world's jargon, they were called in-and-outs.
You go in and you get out. You pull a quick one for the road.
It was a popular sport that Corsicans liked to play often.
That was the first tier when you started to attack banks. You would go to a bank with a buddy or two. You'd take the cash that was up front, the safe behind the counter, and then you'd bolt.
It would last 3 to 5 minutes tops. We'd go in, take what was in the register, the safe behind the counter, and we were out of there.
Just a few weeks after these first in-and-outs, young Francis Mariani excelled when it came to express robberies, and he impressed his elders.
Francis was never ambivalent. Within an hour of entering organized crime, he had a personality, determination. He looked at you a certain way. Despite the fact that he was young and starting out, we knew that this guy was good stock, as we like to say around here. He was a good stock. I robbed the post office with him. I really didn't need to, but he was very insistent with me. So I said, fine, let's do it.
The post office robbery was a simple formality. On the drive back, Mariani suggested that they stop at another bank to end the day on a high note.
Between Avignon and Cavaillon, he said to me, I know a little bank. Come on, let's stop and rob it. But he made you feel uneasy because you would calculate the risks. There was no risk for him because he wasn't afraid to die.
The only risk was prison, but it was part of the job. In 1977, Francis Mariani was once again arrested for armed robbery. He was 28 years old and would stay incarcerated for 4 years.
In the prisons, it's true that we always separated ourselves from the others. We stuck together. It's true that every prison holds a few Corsican fellows, and when they recognize each other, they make each other feel welcome.
While in prison, Francis Mariani established solid ties with the thugs from the Corsica Marseilles organization. These ties proved to be quite valuable to the new Brise de Mer gang once he was out of prison.
Francis Mariani cut his teeth in the gangster world and then joined La Brise de Mer, mainly because of his ties with the village, since his house was right outside the village of La Porta, the Gozzelli brothers' stronghold.
La Porta, a village at an hour's drive from Bastia, was the other birthplace of La Brise de Mer. Francis Mariani, but also Angelo, Paul-Louis, and Francis Gozzelli all grew up there and would become pillars of the Bastia clan. It was the beginning of the 80s, and the Gozzelli brothers quite easily welcomed their turbulent neighbor into their new gang, La Brise, which combined their network and experience and their thirst for a fight. Back to Bastia at the end of the 70s. Richard Casanova's path before joining La Brise de Mer was not that of a gangster, at least not at first. His dream was to ride motorcycles, and he began amateur racing. But when he was 17, the events that rocked the island changed his destiny.
Rishad was 17 or 18 years old. He had political opinions like many young people in Corsica at the time, and the Corsican National Liberation Front had just been formed, so he followed it closely, very closely.
From 1976, when the Corsican National Liberation Front, or FLNC, was formed, it claimed Corsican independence and opposed the French government through violent action.
We joined the FLNC at a time when, in the 70s, there were, let's say, all the national liberation struggles all around the world. So those were the ideals that many young people shared in Corsica and around the world. And we included ourselves in that process.
Over the next 10 years, more than 150 attacks were committed each year in the name of FLNC ideals. Like on the night of March 9th, 1979, when the nationalist group went after banks.
Dans des tracts laissés sur place, le FLNC explique qu'en s'attaquant aux banques, il a voulu combattre le colonialisme qui utilise ces établissements de crédit comme moyen d'oppression du peuple corse.
Rishad Casanova was among those who planted the bomb. He was barely 20 years old and fully dedicated to the cause.
Rishad came with a friend of his. First, they robbed a warehouse containing explosives for quarries, and then they went on their tour. They would drive around Bastia. Rishad would light fuses and throw them at bank windows. That night, there were 20 or so explosions in the north of Corsica, and he caused most of them. He did lots of crazy things.
The FLNC's armed struggle needed funding. The revolutionary tax, as the nationalist movement's leaders called it, served that very purpose.
The revolutionary tax was used to buy weapons, find hideouts, finance trips, and people to carry out operations, etc. It was used to run things.
To ensure the running of things, the FLNC required that companies and shop owners pay the tax, willingly or not. But at times, the nationalist movement would also directly take away from the banks, which they considered to be accomplices of colonialism.
That's how Rishad started robbing banks. It was for the FLNC. When you did that, it was 50-50. You'd keep half the money, and the other half went into the FLNC's accounts.
At the end of the 70s, Rishad Casanova set up his base camp in Marseilles. From there, he committed robberies throughout the region.
With that money, he was also able to finance his motorcycle races because that was his passion. He was a very, very good racer. The guy rode very, very fast. He went to the mainland early on. He was really good.
I had 3, 4 buddies. We did robberies together, and every time they would mention a certain Richard. They said, we went to Albi with him. He competed in a race, and then we robbed a bank. He put his motorcycle in the van. And one day, we were at a cafe in Marseilles, and this guy shows up, Richard, a really friendly guy with big glasses, and we really hit it off. He was a great, extraordinary guy, but you never would have known he was a gangster at first, if you didn't know what he had done. He even told me he was from the FLNC. Can you imagine?
Rishad Casanova was not yet 21, an age where nothing is impossible, when you feel immortal. And little by little, he too carved out his path in Marseille's world of organized crime, going from robberies to motorcycle races at a frantic pace, until that day in December 1980.
The police finally spotted him. He was arrested almost red-handed as he was about to rob a bank, and that meant prison.
Rishad Casanova was now facing 10 years in prison, maybe more. But 5 months into his sentence, the political situation gave him newfound hope.
Dimanche 10 mai 1981, nous vivons ensemble un moment décisif. François Mitterrand est élu président de la République.
Granting amnesty for political prisoners was one of the promises François Mitterrand had made, particularly for incarcerated members of the FLNC.
From then on, Casanova went to the heads of the movement to say, I was arrested under common law, but now I have to become a political prisoner to be released through presidential amnesty.
For Casanova to be considered a political prisoner, the FLNC had to recognize that his actions had been on behalf of the movement.
They said, no, it's out of the question to say that the FLNC committed robbery and made money that way, and they refused.
For Casanova, it was a slap in the face. The FLNC had dropped him after he'd given so much to the cause.
Something broke. For him, it meant go to hell. But then, 3 months later, he got lucky and was released. 3 or 4 cases concerning him were dropped, and he got out.
Richard Casanova now has his hands free, and he already had a solid track record as an armed robber. He would very quickly draw the attention of the growing Brise de Mer.
In the crime world in Marseille, everybody knew each other, so Rishad, even though he was 10 years younger, was very quickly noticed by La Brise.
They would pinpoint. There was a sort of crime school spotting done by the veterans. They would look for the most restless and capable guys.
Rishad was from Bastia. just like them, a native son. So it was fate.
Richard Casanova is a guy who was recruited by Brise de Mer because they'd seen what he could do in the Corso Marseilles organization, and he was now going to enter this extremely tight-knit group.
There, Richard Casanova met Francis Mariani, who was fresh out of prison. Very quickly, what seemed to be an unbreakable friendship was born out of the two men's appetite for armed robbery. The alliance between the two men ushered Brise into a new era.
It started in '81. We realized that we had a lot of armed robberies. I can tell you that. When I worked in the public prosecutor's office, we sometimes had 4 or 5 robberies per day.
During the 80s, we estimated that Brise de Mer had committed about 100 robberies in France. That's huge.
For Brise, that was the end of quick in-and-out robberies. From then on, the Bastia natives had bigger plans. They would follow another gang's example. A Parisian gang, for whom the media quickly came up with the now famous nickname, the Postiche Gang, because of the props they used for the robberies.
La méthode est connue. On prend une petite agence, les vitres teintées, l'intérieur invisible, les coffres bien remplis. Plutôt la Côte d'Azur ou les beaux quartiers de Paris.
Ils sont grimés, affublés de perruques, de faux nez et de fausses moustaches.
Ils prennent en otage employés et clients, travaillent très vite.
Puis, au marteau et au burin, on va forcer les compartiments de la chambre forte.
The Postiche Gang had just introduced this new method which would soon be emulated first and foremost by Brise de Mer.
They started at the same time as the Paris Postiche Gang. They were friends, actually. They were friends and helped each other out.
Every time a bank was robbed and a prop was mentioned in bank employee testimonies, you figured it had been the Postiche Gang and everyone was lost. The police, the media, the bankers. No one really knew who the Postiche Gang was. And Brise de Mer used that diversion, that artifice, that trick.
Robbers with props struck everywhere, sometimes simultaneously. There was the Paris Gang, but there were also smaller groups that weren't as organized and always ended up getting caught. And in the middle of it all, Brise rode the wave and took advantage of the confusion.
Francis Mariani, Rishad Casanova acted like the Postiche Gang. Brise was already doing it, but no one was talking about them. Only the Postiche Gang was being talked about.
This was one of Brise de Mer's strong points. They committed a countless number of bank robberies using the same methods as the Belaïche group from Paris's Ménilmontant neighborhood. They hid behind that group, which was arrested and decimated. Brise de Mer undeniably became the most effective Postiche gang since they never got caught.
Question. Que peut penser un banquier lorsqu'il voit arriver quelqu'un déguisé de la sorte avec un pistolet mitrailleur à la main? Réponse. Bien sûr, il pense que c'est un hold-up.
Journalists enjoyed impersonating the Postiche Gang, but the reality was quite different, much more elaborate.
If you were wearing a mask, they wouldn't let you in. It's like when you showed up wearing gloves. You wouldn't get in. But if you showed up in a wig or a mustache, you looked nice. It was okay. You rang, and they would let you in. The props were used in the movies. We called it movie makeup. And we had a makeup artist. I think in Paris it cost 4 million francs. With a good makeup job, you would look like someone different.
We wore wigs, glasses, we put glue on our fingers to hide our fingerprints. That's what you did at the time, to mask your prints. We'd use cotton cylinders used by dentists to deform our jaws, make fake moles. A bandage, as if we had a cut because people noticed details. They would focus on the bandage rather than on the rest of their face.
Those are the kind of props we had. A wig, movie makeup, and when you went in, you were someone else.
Why did they use props? Because they knew well and good that it was the beginning of security cameras. You had to disguise yourself so you wouldn't be identified in the footage.
The method for robbing banks, however, did not change. A first group wearing props would go through the security door and immediately hold up to customers and employees. The second group, wearing ski masks, would take care of breaking into the safes with hammers and chisels. The commando used walkie-talkies and scanners to check police frequencies and make sure that no one had sounded the alarm.
At that time, in the 80s, things were pretty simple. It was you, your luck, and your balls.
Put that way, it sounds simple, but still, it was meant for guys who had nerves of steel. And for La Brise, it was convenient, because they had plenty of those.
Basically, when they needed to go into a bank, they preferred to go in first rather than lag behind. Or when they had to get something done, they did. A lot of thugs are lazy. They don't want to work, so they become thugs. But not these guys. They were determined, very determined. That's why they were pretty successful at a lot of things. They were warriors, believe me. They were warriors in every sense of the word. And they were also strategists.
The job implied finding a target, doing the kind of recon that was on par with what government agencies would put in place. They had employee pictures, routines. That's actually what made them superior. Infiltration.
Infiltration was Richard Casanova's special talent. He was particularly gifted at approaching an employee and getting not only the building's floor plans, but also precious details on the bank's routine.
Richard Casanova was the brains. He was very perceptive. He was the kind of guy you could drop in New York City, and an hour later, he would have money in his pocket. He was a wonderful guy.
I've often heard that Richard Casanova had an almost military way of organizing things. He became known for his precision and organizational skills.
Each person brought their skill to the table. They complemented each other. If you look at a football team, you have attackers, midfielders, defense, a goalkeeper. If you only have defenders, you don't score any goals.
In just a few years, the robberies generated huge amounts of money, and the rules for dividing it up were strict.
If they got a deal tomorrow, they would have to split it 10 ways. Here's an example. If they found a bag of money, they took the bag and shared it with everyone. That's how it worked.
Whether they were involved in a robbery or not, the core members received the same amount. This was quite an unusual way of doing things in organized crime.
La Brise de Mer was actually a board of directors.
It was the Dome. We called it the Dome.
Each month, the board of directors met, and they would have the famous handing out of envelopes. That is the sum of all their crimes, divided equally between them.
This method of sharing contributed to the absolute solidarity that La Brise's godfathers owed each other. Solidarity was what they were known for.
Everybody stepped aside a little when they came in. They were already La Brise de Mer. Even before they wrote their story, they were already pretty well known and feared. Yeah, it was already starting. Corsicans were feared at the time. And everyone would say, "It's La Brise." It was impressive. At the time, 10 of them would show up somewhere together. My heart would beat pretty hard. Because, for example, that guy, Pierre-Marie Santucci, I was young and I didn't like him. But I would say to myself, I can't kill him, then I'll have to kill his brother, then all his friends, and then I'll have to kill the other 9. You understand?
If you had a problem with either one of them, they were all there.
You weren't going to say, I'm going to kill him and then I can rest easy. You would have been in bad shape. All for one and one for all. That was their motto.
The fraternity within La Brise de Mer would not waver for many years to come. Like after Francis Mariani's arrest for attacking an armored truck in Corsica in December of 1983. Mariani was incarcerated at the Sainte Claire de Bastia prison, and he didn't intend on being there for very long.
He didn't get why he was being locked up. So he was always looking for a way to get out, to escape.
Francis Mariani knew he could count on La Brise and on Rishad Casanova in particular.
Encore la prison de Bastia, encore une évasion. François Mariani soupçonné d'une tentative de hold-up en Balagne.
It was Rishad Casanova who set up the escape of Francis. They'd bought some rope, but more importantly, they had bribed the watchtower guy so he would look the other way. That story illustrates the kind of relationship they had. Francis and Rishad were very close. When you think back, they were the best of friends. That was their strength, because this friendship wasn't just about business.
Now on the run, Francis Mariani would logically need to keep his head down, but that would be misjudging him.
You don't have to rob banks. You can just get your share. But no, that wasn't him. He had to be in the middle of it.
14h cet après-midi sur le Prado, en plein centre de Marseille. Un commando armé fait irruption dans cette agence de la banque Bonas.
Mariani was a bank robbery addict, and this time, he would push back his own limits, as well as those of his accomplices.
They robbed Bonas Bank with some guys from Marseilles who were also young at the time. They broke the lockboxes. They stayed in for a long time.
Francis Mariani led the commando, and for him, it was clear. There was no way they were leaving the bank until all the lockboxes had been opened, without exception. The clock was ticking, and Mariani's accomplices were getting impatient.
The Marseille guys started to get scared. They said, let's go, let's go. They were shaking. But Francis kept on breaking lockboxes open. He did it because he was afraid of nobody and of nothing.
But inside the bank, the robbers' anxiety was at its peak. They became more threatening, and the hostages were terrified.
On one end, people started yelling, pleading, and after an hour and 15 minutes, you see, people were wetting themselves. So he removed his ski mask. Francis Mariani removed his ski mask and said to a witness, "Here, look at me. You can see my face."
By exposing himself out of pure bravado, was Francis Mariani trying to set an example for his accomplices? Regardless, this heist is remembered as being a great success. Over 200 lockboxes were broken into. But there was also an eyewitness who would end up identifying Francis Mariani on the judicial identification forms. For the next 3 months, Mariani used his native Corsica as a hideout, more or less.
Francis Mariani was, as he had been many times in his career, on the run. People were looking for him. And that's something I've always enjoyed, because it's actually a hunt. The police is kind of on a manhunt, but instead of hunting game, you're hunting a gangster.
The police tracked Mariani for several months and finally spotted him in a high-end restaurant in Ajaccio, where he was serenely having dinner with a friend.
I went straight for him, while a colleague pointed a gun at him. I cuffed him. He insulted my boss by saying, "I'm gonna feed you this arrest, Mancini." At that moment, the pianist stopped playing, and my boss told him to keep on playing, and the pianist kept on playing while we took Mariani away.
Prison was part of the game. It's like everything else. When you climb rocks, you risk falling. It's the same thing.
Falling was a bank robber's worst nightmare. But there was even worse. A bank robbery gone wrong. A firearm that suddenly became more than just a scare tactic. June 22nd, 1984. In Bastia, the very stronghold of Brise de Mer, 3 men attacked the BIAO, a bank in the center of the city.
Armés, le visage masqué, les individus obligent le caissier de la banque à leur remettre le contenu de la caisse. L'alarme est donnée, les policiers arrivent très vite sur les lieux. Ils se trouvent alors nez à nez avec les braqueurs qui sortent de la banque. L'un d'eux tire. Un policier s'effondre dans le couloir. Il est atteint de 3 balles de pistolet.
One of my officers was shot in the back. He was injured. This case had a huge impact on me. It was one of the most important cases in my entire professional life.
The officer injured by the robbers was 43-year-old Pierre Toussaint Angelini. The 3 shots in his arm and abdomen would leave him disabled for life. That afternoon, he was riding in a police rescue van when he was ordered to go back to the BIAO bank. According to preliminary reports, a robbery had just been committed and the perpetrators were on the run.
3 of us hurried on the scene in a van. The driver stayed in the van, and a colleague and I looked around. Nothing here, nothing there. And then we started to walk towards the main door of the building. On this emergency exit, I went in thinking the robbery was over. And I thought maybe there were people who were injured, so I went in.
Angelini and his colleague fell face to face with 2 of the robbers. One was holding the bank teller hostage. Angelini's colleague turned back, claiming he would call for backup.
The colleague who was with me, instead of staying, he went to get help. It was too late for that. He said he was going to get help, but I ended up alone in this situation.
The 2 robbers escaped with the hostage. When he got up again, Angelini heard a woman's voice inside the bank.
I heard someone call for help. I heard yelling inside, "Help, help!" So I went in. I walked towards where the cry for help was coming from, because there were stairs going down. And that's when I got hit. I stopped moving, shot in the back. I didn't understand what was happening. I actually wondered what happened, because at that moment, you don't feel anything.
Outside the bank, police reinforcements had just arrived.
Une course-poursuite s'engage alors entre les policiers et les malfaiteurs. L'un d'eux se réfugie dans un magasin de la rue César Camping qui, il est vite ceinturé par les policiers et emmené au commissariat.
The man who was arrested came from a good family in Bastia and was officially unknown by the police. But the police investigators quickly obtained additional information.
They were linked to Brise de Mer at the time. It was quite recent, but they were supported by Brise de Mer.
He was a friend of friends who worked for Brise de Mer, but at the bottom of the totem pole. Those guys were not at the top. They were underlings. They were being used.
The guy who was arrested was someone very close to Rishad Casanova. But he wasn't really a gangster. So, of course, Rishad was furious because the heist was poorly planned. It was a spur-of-the-moment thing. And the result was a badly injured cop. It was serious.
Angelini had been left for dead. There were 2 or 3 doctors on the scene. The diagnosis was most serious. So basically, I was advised to let the family know. And that was a very tough moment, very tough.
Thankfully for Commissioner Dragacci, the investigation was progressing quickly, especially since another robber had been positively identified by a policeman when he was escaping.
It was a done deal. Even if there had been bloodshed, it was still a done deal. I even had the deposition of a policeman who lived next door to one of the perpetrators, or the family of the perpetrator, anyway. He came and testified and said, I saw, etc. So the link was obvious, a piece of evidence, as they say in law.
But Dragacci's optimism quickly dissipated. That evening, the policeman witness went back to see the commissioner.
He wanted to withdraw his statement. Somewhere along the way, he had been asked to think about what he had said. Gangsters, surely, because the policeman didn't actually tell me that. So what I did was I pushed the doors wide open. It must have been 10 or 11 at night. I kicked him in the butt and threw him out, even if it was against the law.
At the Bastia police station, the young robber was being questioned. Exasperated, the police were determined to move the investigation forward.
Even though the young guy wasn't the one who shot the police officer, one of their guys was between life and death. The next logical step was for the young guy to end up naked and handcuffed. And they fought over who was going to hit him. It was a pretty normal reaction on their part. Brise had informants everywhere, even at the police station, so they knew immediately.
Around midnight or 1 in the morning, I got an anonymous phone call saying that someone wanted to give us additional information to what we had to help with the investigation. So, of course, I couldn't ignore the phone call, if only out of professional curiosity.
The phone call was Rishad, but to lure him, he didn't tell him. He just said he had information and to meet him on St. Nicholas Square.
I showed up in the vicinity of Saint Nicolas Square. I came across a young man, more like a grouch, a little thug, calling out to me with authority, or at least he was trying to. He explained that we should not do any brutal questioning, as if that were a police practice. And if we did, I'd have to answer to them, etc. It was Rishad Casanova.
He said, if you keep hitting him, your guys are going to pay, and I'm holding you responsible. That said it all.
It was obviously a threat, saying that if they confessed under torture, or who knows. And so he was warning me about reprisals. Anyway, he definitely didn't ask me to meet so he could congratulate me. Of course, I dismissed the idiot and continued to do what I needed to do.
On the premises of Bastia's central police station, however, the threats seemed to have found an echo.
Well, they stopped hitting him. It was what they wanted anyway. Dragaci said something like, I realize that you're not going to give your accomplices up, but you, however, you're going to pay. Something like that.
The investigation helped track down and arrest the other two accomplices. The trial did not take place in Corsica, but on the mainland, in Grenoble.
Grenoble ce matin, sécurité renforcée au palais de justice. Partout sur les toits, des tireurs d'élite venus spécialement pour les audiences. La raison de cette haute surveillance, la crainte d'un procès sous influence.
It was a legitimate fear. Since the arrest, Brise had been working behind the scenes to track down the witnesses. As a result, one of the bank employees who had seen one of the robbers' faces was no longer sure he could identify him. The clerk, who was hit in the face with a rifle butt, finally swore that she had run into an iron cabinet on her own.
Let's say some people were afraid to talk. They'd say, I don't want to get involved in other people's business. I'm not talking. You can figure it out on your own.
The witness saves himself. Of course he does. He doesn't want to, how do I put it, get harassed for years or maybe even get shot. Fear is human.
Affaire Corse pour jurés grenoblois, les trois jeunes gens sont accusés de vol avec violence et pour l'un d'entre eux de tentative de meurtre. Ils risquent de 20 ans de réclusion à la perpétuité.
The sentences were, of course, lighter than initially announced. The robber caught in the act, as well as one of his accomplices, were sentenced to 6 years in prison. The third robber, who had been identified by the police, was suspected of shooting Pierre Toussaint Angelini in the back. But without this determining testimony, he was simply acquitted.
He was acquitted. He was no longer a gangster. He could live his life however he wanted. I ran into him once. We were walking up the boulevard, and my wife said to me, "Don't turn around. He's walking down." I said, "If I don't turn around, it means that I'm scared of him." He was pushing a prom. I looked at him. He looked down. What was I going to do? I wasn't going to jump him and strangle him.
The case of the BIAO robbery gone wrong in no way slowed down Brise's criminal activity. The bank robberies happened one after another at a steady pace until the late 80s. The Bastia clan's godfathers would also attack cash transportation, sometimes with the complicity of the transporters or outright with a bazooka. From the prison where he was incarcerated, Francis Mariani didn't miss any of the show. He was thrilled because even though he was temporarily inactive, he knew he would get his share. Mariani was at home there, so he bided his time.
I knew Francis Mariani in prison, and he was a boss, a godfather. Legend had it that when he would put his hand around your neck affectionately, like this, you were safe in prison. No one messed with you anymore. Just like in Sicily, Sicilian godfathers would do that. It was, you were covered, protected, yeah. You were not supposed to go against his orders, his word. . As soon as he arrived, he would go to the prison warden and say, "Watch yourself. I want to go wherever I want. I'm going to pick out my cell. I want to be close to my friends, the Corsicans. And if you don't want your car to end up on the 6th floor of a building, you're going to leave me alone. Because I can just call someone to plant a bomb and your car will end up on the 6th floor. If you mess with me, I have people on the outside. The ball's in your court." I didn't say the bullet's in your head. I said the ball is in your court. And he got everything. We showered twice a week. It was dirty, but he had a bathrobe, like in a hotel. Normally, the shower was wash, soap up, rinse off. He'd say, "Turn the shower on. Nice and hot."
When it came to food, eating in the prison cafeteria was out of the question for him. Francis Mariani got deliveries from the outside and shared them with his friends.
He would say, "I want 10 kilos of lobster, 10 kilos of jumbo shrimp. I want the best oysters from who knows where. I want pastries, meat, cheese, Corsican ham, Corsican wine." We had it all. And then we would eat all together. We got what we wanted.
Francis Mariani stayed in prison for 5 years, until the early 90s. Meanwhile, his friend Rishad Casanova put Brise de Mer in the spotlight once again by doing an over-the-top heist, one of the century's most memorable crimes.